So Felix Salten, who was the author of the original book from 1923, he was an avid hunter. So it's a little bit hypocritical that he was a hunter and then, then wrote a book about it, but maybe because he was a hunter, he had like first-hand experience with it, whatever. But it was also a thing where he was Austrian Jew, and obviously this is, it's not a good time to be a Jew, right? So he wrote it as kind of an allegory for persecution against Jews and against persecution against other minorities in general. So this is why he wrote it, and we'll talk about like this a little bit later when we talk about like the themes in history. But anyway, that's why he wrote the book, right? So the book got translated, and then in 1933, he ended up selling the rights to it, for only $1,000. Again, I don't know what it is with people in those days, like all the like people writing short stories, just getting mugged off, like getting paid almost no money for it, wherever. But he ended up selling the rights to his story to Sidney Franklin. So Sidney Franklin, he was a director at MGM, and Sidney Franklin wanted to make it into a live action film. However, obviously the fact that like it's the 1930s, right? So there's no CGI, the technology is just not there and stuff, right? So to make a whole feature length film where you've just got animals, and obviously just how are you gonna know, how are you gonna get them to like stick on the script? How are you gonna get a deer to talk to a rabbit? Like it's not possible, right? So as a result of that, Sidney Franklin, after a lot of experimentation, just was like, okay, we're going to sell the rights of this to Walt Disney. So Walt Disney ended up buying the rights to the film in April 1937. However, although Disney liked the story, right, it was a thing where obviously it was, as he said, too grim and too somber. And because it was aimed more at like an adult audience, it was a thing where they were like, well, we're going to need to change the actual storyline quite a lot. And also, although they had drawn deers in Snow White, they wanted the animation for the deers in this to be a lot more realistic, and the animators at that point weren't really there, and lots of things were happening with like the Disney studios at this time. You had obviously Snow White that had just come out, you had Pinocchio, you were working on Fantasia, so as a result Bambi ended up being shelved like kind of as an idea for a little bit of time. So in 1938, Walt Disney got together two writers. So this is Percy Pearce and this is Carl Fulberg. And he got them to work together on a storyline for Bambi. However, like we said, because lots of things were in flux at the time, although they had done the storyboards, production didn't actually start until August the 17th of 1939, right? And it took almost 11 months of 7 writers to come up with what the actual like a script for Bambi would be like. And the reason for this, as it's been described by some of the writers, there was like a million different tangents that they all went off, right? So there was meant to be a bit where Bambi knocks over an anthill, and then it kind of like, the story kind of like pivots toward talking to these ants. And then there's meant to be a thing with grasshoppers as well, where the grasshoppers are there. There's meant to be talking leaves. There's also meant to be a kind of like Laura and Hardy kind of like duo, where there's a squirrel and there's like a chipmunk and stuff, and they have like banter between each other and like kind of, so all that kind of stuff got completely shelved. And also as well, because Disney still wanted the story to be quite dark, he originally wanted Man to be a character, and he wanted Man to end up being burnt to death by his own fire, which obviously they cut out and stuff, because they was like, well, actually, let's just have Man completely off screen, and like, so you don't end up obviously seeing that. And then also with regard to the bunnies, right? So as we said in our video where we talked about Snow White, what Disney wanted, was for each of the dwarfs to have their own personalities. And a similar thing was going to be done with regard to the different bunnies. So there was meant to be 6 bunnies, and all of them were meant to have like their own kind of personalities. But what was decided instead was that we're going to scale back on that, and instead they were just going to have, several bunnies that were there, but Thumper's the only one with like a proper name, and he's the only one who's like an actual like proper character and stuff, right? So all of this ends up explaining basically the story of the creator and all the kind of like creative processes that went into making Bambi. So originally the film was supposed to be 82 minutes long, right? but they end up cutting out 12 minutes of screen time, yeah, because they got rid of all these like extra things that didn't really add to the story and kind of took it too far away from what the original was. So talking about the story of the studio. So obviously the animators had experience drawing deers in Snow White. However, as it was described by them, they kind of looked like big sacks of flour, right? And it was a thing where they didn't actually want the deers to look like that. They wanted them to look very realistic. They wanted them to look like actual deers. So what they actually did is Disney set up a small zoo within the studio. So you had deers, you had rabbits, all these different things here. And also it encouraged the animators to go and visit LA Zoo. And this is in order to see the animals up close and to kind of like see their movements, see what they actually look like in detail, rather than kind of like, as you had with Snow White, kind of drawing the ideas that people have of what a deer should look like. However, although they've gone through all this process to make the animals look more realistic, it was a thing where there still had to be an element to which they had to be relatable. So much like we've said with Pinocchio, right? You can't have Pinocchio looking too much like a puppet, and you can't have Jiminy Cricket looking too much like a cricket. They had to do the original sketch for them, and then they had to make them more like human, like more cute, like kind of, you know. So that's the same thing that they did with regard to animals in here, especially when the animal's a bit younger. So, you know, you end up having baby-like features, right? So you end up having shorter snouts than they would in real life, and also much bigger eyes. And this kind of helps the characters to become relatable, for us to have empathy for them, right? If they just look like a rabbit, if they just look like a deer, then it's more difficult for people to be able to have empathy towards them, especially for like little kids and stuff. They just will see it as that. And then also, like we said, although there are no humans that appear on screen, it was still a thing where they still used two human models in order to help with the ice skating scene. So obviously there's a scene where Bambi and Thumper are skating about on ice. And so they had two figure skaters who were doing the ice skating, right? While the animators looked at how like their movement was, etc. So when you see Bambi and Thumper on ice, how they're moving about is based off of how humans would move on the ice, right? Rather than just how an animal was, because obviously a rabbit's not going to be able to skate about like that. And obviously Bambi, you know, he falls down in a kind of a cute way, but most animals wouldn't actually kind of fall in the same way and stuff. So basically wanted to again look like how humans would do ice skating and stuff. So now talk about the casting, right? Now, I don't know why they did this, but they had basically three voice actors for each of the three main characters, right? So for each character, you know, like kind of like talk about Bambi, Thumper, and Flower, you have a baby version, then there's like a little kid version, then there's a kind of like teenage version of all three of them. So I don't really know why I did that, because I think personally they probably could have just got like one actor for each, and then, you know, maybe have them do a bit more of a baby voice, and then like a bit more of a kind of little kid's voice, and then a bit more of like a teenage voice. I feel like they kind of could have pulled that off without needing to hire, you know, 9 actors to do like 3 roles. Yeah, but anyway, that's my take. So you had that, but in terms of like the casting, there wasn't really any notable people, right? So Bambi isn't voiced by anyone who is in anything else that's really significant. Talking about the so-called young adult Thumper, this is voiced by Sam Edwards. So Sam Edwards, he's in Little House on the Prairie as like the banker or something like that, right? He's kind of a minor character, so not really worth talking about. And then talking about Sterling Holloway, right? So Sterling Holloway, he is the voice of Mr. Stork in Dumbo. He's the voice of the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. He's the voice of Car in the Jungle Book. He's the voice of Rockford the Mouse in Aristocats. And he's also the voice of Winnie the Pooh. You know, so we spoke about him at length when we were talking about Dumbo. And yeah, he's kind of the only notable voice actor. You know, and talking about the mole, for instance, who appears like a little bit on screen, that is actually the voice of Percy Pierce. So like we said, that's one of like the key writers for the story. So that's kind of it. That's the casting. You can look through the casting list and it's not anyone who's like really appears in anything else, right? So you can kind of see why this was a very, very cheap film for Disney, right? So as we said in the video for Dumbo, it's a thing where, all of the best animators went to Bambi, and obviously you can see the difference of that. But it's the thing where everything else seemed to go to Dumbo, right? So all like the best voice actors, all the best dialogue, and also as well all the best songs as well. Like Bambi doesn't really have any real songs in it. Like there's not anything that's that notable. The studio, you can see why it's like such a cheap film and stuff, because I can't really see what they spent the money on other than like paying for like all like the really good animators. So now we're talking about the themes and the history, right? So as we said, the major theme, the whole reason why the book was set up in the first place, was to do with kind of allegory about persecution, especially of Jews, but also of other minorities. So much in the same way as George Orwell, when he wrote Animal Farm, he could have just spoken about the Russian Revolution and like a critique of Stalin, like in human terms, but actually it is sometimes a lot more effective, having animals as like the metaphors for that. So the reason for that is because people, without realizing it, kind of get the message of like who you're trying to critique, but also as well it's more accessible to children, and so it's a way of kind of universalizing the message of it and stuff, right? So that's kind of why Felix Salten ended up doing it in that way. And it's the thing where Felix Salten, although he wrote it in 1923, at that time you had a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, and especially in Germany and Austria. So he could see what was going to happen in Europe, right? So he's kind of given a warning about that. And actually, it was a thing where in 1936, his books end up being banned in Germany. Well, not just banned, burnt in Germany. And when you're having the Anschluss, between Germany and Austria in 1938, this is where basically he just packed his things and just went to Switzerland, and he lived there for the rest of the war. And he died in, I believe, October of 1945. And it's also something to note that this film came out in 1942, and by this point, America had finally joined World War II. So obviously, in a way, this kind of ties in with the war effort in a kind of like more indirect way and stuff. So kind of getting people to see like the dangers of Nazism, even though the film, when you watch it, you don't really get that feel at all, because like because Disney changed the story of it so much away from what the original was. It's less clear what the original intent was, and so you end up kind of watching it and just thinking this is a story about this, right? But anyway, so you have that. Also as well, with regard to it, the other theme that you could say that was really notable is environmentalism, right? So again, similar to Dumbo, it's kind of like way ahead of its time in terms of getting humans to think about how they're interacting with nature, because the humans aren't even on screen throughout the film, but they are incredibly disruptive. All of the animals are just living in peace, they're just going about their lives, and then all of a sudden, bang, 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 they're getting shot from all different places. The whole place ends up going up in flames because the humans are too stupid to know how to build a proper campfire without burning everything. And so it's just carelessness, destructiveness, and kind of getting people to think about how they're actually kind of like looking after things, and being stewards of creation as such, right? So that's kind of a major theme that they had, and so again, it's way ahead of its time in that regard. And it's also quite ironic, I think, that obviously Salten himself, he was an avid hunter, but maybe he wrote it because he had such experience with it, and so he was able to kind of relate to the destructiveness of humans when they go hunting and stuff. So anyway, that kind of talks about the kind of like themes and the history of the film, and now we're going to talk about the legacy.